It's Friday, 6 o'clock. Welcome to BCFM's World Cup Free Politics Show. But before we begin this evening's show, I'd like to read out the press statement from the Treasury about special measures being taken by Her Majesty's Government this evening relating to the UK banking sector, British tax havens and social security payments. The statement reads as follows. From 6pm this evening, all transactions in and out of the UK and all Crown dependencies, including the Isle of Man, Channel Islands and Cayman Islands, will be prohibited and accounts have been frozen. When banks and markets open next Wednesday, that's the 20th of June 2018, a new maximum transfer amount of £1,000 per account per week will come into force. No new accounts will be allowed to open. Where the payment of wages is affected by these limits, account holders will need to apply to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs for permission to close offshore accounts and transfer all funds to a UK account on the payment of 50% exchange control tax, a new tax. Banking licences will be withdrawn at midnight tonight from all London's merchant banks, as well as RBS, Ulster Bank, Clydesdale Bank, NatWest, HSBC, Lloyds, Barclays and their subsidiaries, which manage 92% of the current accounts in the UK, pending appointment of new Treasury-nominated directors and executives to those banks. The National Audit Office will replace the auditing role of KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young and Deloitte as UK core bank auditors. Individual banking licences will not be reinstated at 1am on Monday morning unless all of these new directives and directors and executives, as well as the National Audit Office, are legally in place at each bank. Link-operated cash machines will be inoperative from midnight tonight and electronic or card payments have been disabled from 6pm. This means the entire UK banking system, apart from cash, will be effectively disabled for 48 hours from midnight tonight. In addition, other measures are being taken this weekend through statutory instruments, emergency legislation on Monday and letters from Buckingham Palace and Downing Street to do the following. First, to request Commonwealth governments adopt similar measures to seize deposits and close tax havens. Second, to close the London Stock Exchange on Monday and Tuesday. Third, to nationalise all UK cash vault delivery and collection services, Link Cash Points and the UK office of the Swift payment system, all three with Treasury-appointed boards. Fourth, to immediately transfer all customs and border officers to port and airport duties with the support of trained sniffer dogs from the prison service and elsewhere to enforce the new exchange control measures. Fifth, all social security welfare claimants will have the weekly income to which they are entitled restored with new weekly minimum of £100 and all reviews and all benefit sanctions cancelled forthwith. It has been decided the liquidity and good standing of the United Kingdom can only be maintained if the wealth now deposited in UK-controlled tax havens is first secured and then taxed at a rate of no less than 50%, and that the rise in destitution and begging is reversed. In measures to be introduced next month, depositors will be able to move deposits abroad from Crown dependencies and the UK, but only by paying this new 90% exchange-controlled tax. Her Majesty's Government has decided to implement this new annual high rate of tax, that of 50% initially, then 25% on the 1st of April every year thereafter, because of the many years which these deposits have remained untaxed. These measures will be followed soon by an unprecedented public sector spending programme, building of public works and infrastructure, including good quality public housing. This statement has been approved and signed by Her Majesty's Secretaries of State, the Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, dated Friday the 15th of June 2018. God save the Queen. Well, did that lift your spirits or put the fear of God into you? That was our fictional scenario of what a future reimposition of exchange controls and banking regulation could look like. The problem being, too many rich and powerful tax avoiders, including the Queen and the newspaper barons, might never allow it. Just a bit of fun. But one day it could happen, and we ought to be ready if it does. A kind of plan B. The failure to act could lead to catastrophic crash that Martin Summers has been warning of for over a decade now. So, I'm Tony Gosling. Helping me review this week's real news is Lib Dem councillor for Redland, Fee Hance. And
Lib Dem? I don't think so, my friend.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Green.
Councillor for, sorry about that, for Redland, Fee Hance. And old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers is here too. So quite a lot of fake news so far on this show today. But I'll ask you maybe first, Martin, what you make of this idea of getting hold of the money that's in tax havens and taxing it, because for so many years it's been sitting there, and the British are being finger is being pointed not only by the rest of the world but also by people like the Tax Justice Network, saying actually it's British Crown dependencies that hold most of this untaxed cash.
Well, it's true, but they're not the only ones. I mean, there's Luxembourg. The state of Nevada in the US has also become a major tax haven.
The Swiss,
yeah. And I'm afraid that the kind of measures that you've suggested, and I believe you've been speaking to Steve Keane about what measures might be appropriate, who's an economist of note at Kingston University, then that sort of thing will only happen if you've had a crash, sadly. Because that's when people suddenly realise that they needed to have done something. But of course, it's a stable hoard that bolted.
Is it simply because the people in power are the people with their savings in cash havens?
Well, exactly. I mean, a crash may come about in a relatively predictable way because everybody can see it coming, or it may happen by accident. If it comes about in a predictable way, the wealthy will have already moved their money where it needs to be to avoid being sequestered. And of course, most of the wealth that's been accumulated in the last 10 years is not because they've invented a better widget. It's because of quantitative easing, which has artificially increased asset prices. In other words, the asset-owning classes in Britain and elsewhere have been bailed out by the taxpayer. The market solution was to allow the crash to happen in 2008, which means a lot of rich people lose all their money and have to go down the job centre. That didn't happen. But most people don't realise that the allocation of resources beyond that point is no longer a market allocation of resources. It just depends on, if you've got assets, asset prices have been goosed by public intervention, which of course isn't in the free market textbook, but that's what they've been doing. But the implication of that in the long run is that money isn't their money, it's our money, and we've got every right to take it back from them.
I mean, there's a Goldman Sachs whistleblower out there who's been saying, well, all this asset transfer, or basically this quantitative easing money is going to these businesses, many of these businesses, but what they're doing is using it for is to actually buy their own shares. Yeah. Rather than actually pay employees more or employ more people, they're using it to buy their own shares up, to artificially bump up their share price.
Yeah, well, this buyback mania has gone completely bonkers. I mean, it used to be if a company had a large cash stash that it had managed to accumulate through genuine trading, they could use it to buy their own shares as a means of, propping up their share price. But what they're actually doing now is that you've got basically what's like a control fraud. People are borrowing money. The heads of these companies are borrowing money to buy the shares, which then pushes the share price up. And most of these people have got share options, so they're making a killing on that. And then when the company goes bust, they'll be long gone with the money. So they're all doing it. Because if you don't do it, you're a fool, because everybody else is doing it, which is why we've got the biggest financial bubble in history, which will burst at some point.
I mean, we've also got a problem here, haven't we? As companies go bust, like Carillion, the people at the centre of that company, that is to say the directors, the financial director, and the chief executive, or the executives on that company, they know that the company's going down. And so they then start to take as much as they can from the company before it finally becomes public that it's no longer viable.
Yeah, well, what you do is you borrow money to pump up your share price. You then because you own quite a few shares, you make a killing on that, and then you stag the shares, you sell them immediately and walk away. Which means you walk away with the cash. Basically, it's looting.
Is that a crime?
No, it isn't, because everybody's doing it. It used to be controlled, but it's not anymore.
Insider dealing, isn't that?
Well,
criminal?
Insider dealing is supposedly criminal, but it actually goes on all the time. If you think about what happened in the missile attack on Syria the other week. That Mrs. May's husband lies in bed with her every night, and basically he knew that the attack was going to happen and when it was going to happen, and he was able to tell his chums to move, to bet appropriately, and therefore a killing was made. And if you are at the level of making decisions about things, when to bomb and who to bomb, and your husband is also a top trader, then your husband, and you can't imagine that they actually lie in bed and don't talk about it. Of course they do, and of course he goes to work next day and makes a killing on the back of it. Is that insider trading? Yes, it is.
Well, on tax havens, there's an estimated £100 billion lost annually because of the £30 trillion which is stashed in tax havens, the majority of which is in Britain and British Crown dependencies. And we're going to hear for a minute from the author, some ideas anyway, from the author of Debunking Economics, Steve Keane. As Martin said, he's a professor down at Kingston University. But Fee, what do you make of of this idea of any kind of attempt to put up exchange controls to stop money. I mean, we're in the situation now, aren't we, where money goes wherever it's cheapest to keep it, and that for quite a long time has been Britain. So in a way, there's an opportunity there to grab that before it disappears.
Well, I mean, it'll astonish you to learn that I'm neither an economist nor a tax expert. But what strikes me is that I think a lot of people are quite confused why it's perfectly legal to avoid tax and pay someone to help you avoid tax, but not to evade it. And there's an awful lot of people legally not paying the tax they should be, and lots of people illegally not paying the tax they should do. And it seems that they're treated in different ways. And one lot of tax evasion is completely respectable, and it's part of the establishment, and everybody does it if you're from a certain background. And if the government was serious about raising funds, they would do something about it rather than penalise people at the bottom of the pile with things like universal credit, which we'll come on to later, but which is actually losing money hand over fist and has saved absolutely nothing.
Well, let's talk about that right now, actually, because there's a report out today from the National Audit Office about universal credit. Martin, we've been talking about universal credit for a long time on here and heard some pretty horrific horror stories about it. The main problem, so far as I can see, or one of the most recent things I've come across, is the complete change that there'll be to housing benefits. So you can be sanctioned whilst on housing benefit in a similar way to people are being sanctioned now. In other words, you could, feasibly within a month, just lose your home. Whereas the situation with housing benefit is if the city council here decides that they think that someone shouldn't be entitled to the housing benefit, you have a long process over a couple of months by which you can prove, yes, actually I'm entitled. What they'll be able to do in future is simply cut it off literally just like that.
Well, yeah, and of course the wait to claim, you've got to wait 6 weeks or now 5 weeks before you can get any money. I mean, the old system was geared on the idea that you wanted to keep people in their houses. They may have lost their job or become sick or some other misfortune, and at that point you want to keep them housed so that they can get themselves sorted out. But the design of universal credit means that people immediately fall into rent arrears, and the other problem is that they won't pay directly to the landlords. So the private landlords won't rent to people on universal credit and evict people if they are on it. So that's why they've had 6 years to roll it out and they've not been able to roll it out, because everywhere they do roll it out, it immediately leads to rent arrears, evictions, and it's the main cause of the increase of measured homelessness that we've seen. But the government won't change course on this, even though they could easily change these basic administrative features of the system, because they want it to be punitive, and that's what the whole idea of it was to make poor people suffer. And that's what they wanted it to do, and that's what it does do.
I think
just
fair,
before you say something, Fee, just to let you know, on the BBC are saying today that universal credit, and they're looking at this report that's come out, could actually cost more than the current benefit system.
Well, surprise. I mean, I think, in fairness, there's been problems with paying housing benefit directly to landlords for some time. That's a policy that was put in a while back. And even under the old system, if your tax credits were changed by as much as 10p, then all of your benefits would be suspended whilst they were reassessed. I mean, I used to come across people all the time that this happened to. I think the big thing with universal credits is the delays that people are undergoing. Something like 25% of people have had excessive delays on that. And, not many people can survive that kind of hiatus in their finance.
Isn't this sort of dog whistle? Delays. The dog whistle here is, look, we don't care who you are or if you're entitled to benefits, go and get a job.
Yes, it's meant to be financially encouraging people to find work, isn't it? I don't know what that means, but frankly, if you're struggling to pay the rent and to put food on the table, you're not going to be out there filling out massive 20-page application forms. Applying for jobs takes time, and you need to be in a decent frame of mind, and a lot of people need a lot of support to get through application forms. God knows, I've been filling a few in myself of late, and I feel their pain. Yeah. And it's not as simple as that. And if you have children, especially benefits for women with single mothers with children have been cut, so they can't claim full benefits past the age of, I think it's 5 now. I mean, you try having any kind of job that you can support yourself on if you've got a couple of kids in primary school.
But the system after the Second World War was designed to help people who were unemployed for short periods of time, and right up until the 1970s we had full employment. So the benefit system has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Somehow, at some point, they're going to have to say, well, that's enough. I
think there was definitely a case for reviewing the benefit system, oh yes, but what they've replaced it with is something which, as you say, is very punitive and aimed at punishing people for being poor. And to boot, I mean, as I think I've mentioned last time I was here, the really wicked lie about all of this is it's saving no money at all. No, it's been rolled out under the premise that, we're saving money and punishing the undeserving poor. It's all quite Dickensian. Punishing the undeserving poor and giving a leg up to the deserving poor. And it's absolutely absolute rubbish. They're saving no money and making it almost impossible for people who are out of work to find it, or making it a lot more difficult anyway.
Martin, some claimants waited 8 months for their first payment on the switch to universal credit, which rolls 6 different benefits into one. The government claimed universal credit would bring £34 billion return over 10 years. I suppose that's 3.4 billion a year, roughly. But they're being told by the National Audit Office today, we're being told, that's complete nonsense. It said more people would get into work and stay there longer. And actually, they have absolutely no way of telling if more people have gone into work or if more people are either homeless on the streets, simply not claiming, or possibly working for organised crime.
Well, I think that's good full marks to the National Audit Office for calling this out. I mean, it's pretty obvious. And I think the real killer, as Fee says, is it's not saving any money. It's actually a vindictive social programme for the sake of having a vindictive social programme. If we wanted to save money, you could simplify the benefit system by making it easier to claim and so on. And I can't see that pushing people into homelessness is getting them jobs. It's just pointless.
Even thinking about something as radical as a minimum income for everybody, minimum wage for everybody, so that the universal income, so everybody gets a certain amount they can live on, whether they're working or not, and make it a decent level. I mean, you only have to wander around Broadmead at 5:30, and it's just awful. There's people bedding down. There's
you never used to see that either.
You saw one or two, but nothing like the levels.
That's right. That's right.
It's just graphic and it's appalling.
Well, where does the money come from? That's what we're always told by the Conservatives. I'm sorry, there is no money. Well, of course there is, and we discussed that right at the start of the programme. £100 billion tax lost annually because of the 30 trillion stashed in tax havens. Now, that 100 billion is not just for the UK, obviously it's for the world, but that's a lot of money that could be going to help build infrastructure for the country, fill up potholes in roads, even maybe put new roads. Who knows?
A couple of doctors maybe might be nice.
Yes.
A couple of doctors, nurses, that
train doctors, train nurses, all sorts of things that money could be used for. Martin, let's get on now to what Steve Keane had to say. He said a crash, in order to prepare for a crash, there's 3 things. We'll run through them one by one. He said, first of all deposits should be unconditionally guaranteed. The notion that depositors are investing in their bank is nonsense.
Yeah, that's pretty much a principle established in the 1930s by the New Deal in the US, and that's right. Depositors should be protected, but shareholders should be cleaned out if the bank goes bust. Although, of course, what's happened with the sale of the tranche of RBS shares recently is that the taxpayer lost £2 billion on that, which means that the shareholders of RBS were given £2 billion by the taxpayer. Have they been looking for jobs, do you think, those people? Have they been sleeping on the street? That's where the money went. £2 billion to shareholders of RBS, who should have been wiped out.
Well, talking of the shareholders, his second point is the shareholders and bondholders of the banks should be on the line first to back the depositors. If they lose everything, then tough. They're investing, and risks are part of that business.
Well, that's right. If you invest in the stock market or in anything, you get a dividend, and that dividend is to compensate you for the risk that you will lose your money. But what we've got here is a one-way system set up where those who are the investors in the stock market, the wealthy classes by definition, get a one-way bet where when shares are going up, they take all the profits, and when shares are going down, the government steps in and bails them out. That's the other thing that's happened. It's not just that we've got all the tax havens have got money in. The government, not just the British government, have stepped in and bailed out the asset-owning classes. If you're going to follow a free market policy, and Austrian school economists have said this, and I've got some sympathy for what they're saying, you let the banks collapse, which means that wealthy people lose all their money.
I mean, what you're saying is really that capitalism died in 2008. This isn't, whatever we have got now, it isn't capitalism.
No, it isn't. It isn't. The Austrian school economists are pretty clear about this. They call it central planning by central banks. I think that they don't understand central planning, but they're also right.
Is it socialism formed by the super rich?
It's socialism for the wealthy, and the devil take the hindmost for everybody else, isn't it?
Yeah, point 3 Steve makes is that the bank should be nationalised with no recompense to shareholders or bondholders, pending restructuring and later resale, possibly. The bank staff bonuses must be frozen. Top management sacked. There has to be pain for failure. And I suppose what he's saying there is that never happened in 2000.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, the illusion is that somehow we've come through the crisis and we're out of the woods, but we're not, because we've basically kicked the can down the road for 8 to 10 years, and now we're coming to the end of that process.
What about this point about a basic living income? Because there's a lot of economists say that this is an important part of all of this.
Well, I think that one of the reasons why universal credit was widely accepted across the political spectrum when Ian Duncan Smith first came up with the idea is because he basically taken that idea. Let's have one benefit. Now, I think there is a problem if you put people's housing and their other benefits. You can't. There's problems with housing. You've got to have a separate set of separate set of institutions to deal with housing. But I think the principle that everybody should be given a basic income, and then they can earn on top of that. Yeah. That really is an incentive to go out to work. Yeah. I'm on universal credit at the moment. I'm working, but I still get a universal credit top-up because I don't earn enough to pay the rent. But 63 pence of every pound I earn goes back to the government. And therefore, beyond a certain point, it's certainly not in my interest to work.
It's certainly increasingly becoming an idea that economists are taking more and more seriously, and I think it was regarded as being an idealistic, hippie, pie-in-the-sky type thing. Yeah. But increasingly people say, actually, it works. The impact on the health system is enormous because people aren't depressed, and it facilitates people re-entry into the workplace.
Well, we'll be talking about the Bilderbergers in part 2, which is the super rich. This is the NATO zone super rich, one of the most powerful business lobby groups in the NATO countries, who I would imagine can afford a few £100 a week to help a few poor people, especially since they've got more money in their bank accounts than they could ever spend. So I would have thought a few bob might be going spare. But I thought we'd have a listen now to Prime Minister's questions, and I suppose this is really very much connected with all of this, which is the slow destruction, it seems, of the benefit system. And this is about poverty and benefits on Wednesday at Prime Minister's questions.
Julie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Ian has lifelong profound learning and physical disabilities. He's doubly incontinent, cannot wash, dress or cook for himself. He's no notion of personal safety and left unsupervised is at risk. He's able to live independently thanks to the support of his elderly mother, who is herself unwell, and by virtue of a local authority social care package. Now, Ian's PIP application that he needs to fund this care has been refused on the grounds that he can cope unaided. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? There is something very wrong with a system that punishes citizens whose only crime is to be born disabled. Will she agree to investigate on behalf of the thousands of vulnerable people who are being made to suffer?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that obviously she raised a specific case, and I'm sure she will understand I don't have the details to address that specific case, and I don't think it would be right to do so here in this chamber. What I can assure her and other members of the House are that individual cases that are raised with me in Prime Minister's questions are taken extremely seriously, and this one will be no exception. So I will ensure that the case is looked at urgently by the relevant minister. Obviously, cases are complex, they are multifaceted, but the case will be looked at urgently.
Do you believe her fee?
I don't think question time's long enough for everyone to bring all their constituents' cases to Parliament where things have gone wrong. I mean, you may know I worked for an MP some time ago. That was a couple of years back, but even then the assessments that people like Atos were making of people were unbelievably inaccurate and unbelievably harsh. We had people who clearly were in no fit state to go to the shops on their own, let alone go and find a job, and they were being assessed as being perfectly capable for work. And even things like doctors' evidence weren't taken into account. The Atos nurses would basically examine them, do a couple of what appeared to be fairly cursory tests, and the appeals, I mean, something like when people had assistance from people like the Avon and Bristol Law Centre, the success rate of the appeals was phenomenally high because people were being assessed wrongly. There was somebody who came to us once who had lost a leg in a motorbike accident, was assessed on a certain level, 6 months later was reassessed and he's put on a different grading. And it's like, well, evidently his leg's still missing. Exactly the it was unbelievable. It was clearly punitive. It was clearly aimed at forcing people off benefits. And this business about, well, disabled people do better when they're in work. Well, everyone does better when they're in work, but you can't starve people into work or force people into work. You have to support them.
The sinister side to this is really the most vulnerable people, many of whom, of course, who are actually born disabled, are being told, there's going to be no money for you. Now, that means no food, that means no transport. It means basically they're housebound and possibly even evicted.
Well, and people with mental health problems as well and other invisible disabilities really have a rough time of it, because quite often mental health issues, they come and go, they're up and down, they're not constant. And so it's very, very difficult to assess realistically, and there just aren't the resources there to assess people properly either.
Martin, why is it legal to take food away from a disabled person?
Well, I'd make 2 points about this. Why is it anybody other than qualified doctors deciding whether people are fit for work or not? What is this, the Burma Railway? And the second point I'd make is that employers don't want necessarily to employ these people. In communist Cuba, every enterprise has to have its number of disabled people on its staff, people with mental health issues. There's full employment in Cuba because it's a planned economy. But can you imagine private sector employers? They're not there. They're not there for the good of society. They're trying to make a profit, so they don't want to employ these people.
I think some of the more enlightened private ones,
I'm just saying
they recognise that diversity is a strength, not a weakness.
Well, indeed, but at the same time, there's no demand side to this.
Phil,
so they're just being thrown out into the streets.
Let me ask you the same question. Why, in any civilised country, is it legal to take food away from a disabled person?
I think they're fairly indiscriminate. They're happy to take food away from anyone, really, aren't they? I mean, when it comes to sanctioning people's benefits, there's equality for you. They're as happy to take benefits away from people who are disabled, able-bodied.
And what about, particularly for youngsters, they might be very, very tempted to say, well, actually, I can go and deal drugs now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an awful lot of... There's an awful lot of sort of under the radar economy going on increasingly, and also there's a large number of young people being out on the streets. Those young people you see out in Broadmead, and they're really if you're under 25, it's damn hard to find a place to live, basically, because even if you can get hold of housing benefit, trying to get a place in a shared house these days is phenomenally difficult. There's huge competition for it.
Have the Greens actually got their head around this, do you think? I don't think we're going to see a Green government at the next Parliament. But
you lack faith, Tony.
One of the things the Greens are very good at is actually introducing ideas that then take on a life of their own.
Well, that indeed, it was quite a few Labour Party ideas we look at and go, oh gosh, that was our idea 10 years ago. How lovely they've taken it up. However, the universal income is one a very strong Green policy, which is, if you look at it, is threaded throughout all of our economic stuff.